Hey guys, it's Sarah from Just My Typewriter, and I'm back with another collection-based video. So I've been collecting typewriters for about 6 years, and I'm not the only typewriter content creator out there on the internet. There are lots of fantastic resources out there if you are interested in typewriters. I highly recommend quite a few YouTube channels, and I'll link a whole list below. But places like Typewriter Chicago, Phoenix Typewriter, great for repair videos, Hot Rod Typewriter. But one channel that I always watch the content of, and one that I've really enjoyed from a collecting standpoint, is Joe Van Cleave. Now, Joe Van Cleave is another typewriter collector. He does some repair videos, some testing videos, and he really does in-depth reviews of individual typewriters, and I've always enjoyed his content. I recently watched this video, which is called Downsizing Your Collection, and I thought it was a really interesting concept. Basically, throughout the video, Joe goes through how he would determine what are his top 5 typewriters. If he had to downsize his collection, which typewriters would he keep, limiting himself to 5. Now, throughout my 6 years of typewriter collecting, I have sold quite a few typewriters, mostly ones that I have fixed and repaired. I like to sell to first-time buyers. I like to be that person to give them that typewriter and give them some experience using that first typewriter. But I've also happened to save quite a few of them, as is evident by my home. Right now, I'm a little over 30 typewriters, with a few being sold or at least listed for sale. So I wanted to sit down and kind of go through, if I had to downsize my collection to keep just 5, what kind of choices would I make and why? Now, knowing that I have so many and different reasons for why I have all of them, I didn't just want to limit myself to 5 typewriters, but rather different categories and how I would select 5 typewriters for each of those categories. Now, another big point here, and one thing to note, is that I am not an avid typewriter user. Despite having a YouTube channel about typewriters, despite fixing them and loving them, I don't write a lot with a typewriter. I do write pen pal letters. Every once in a while, I'll do an art project that involves a typewriter, but most of my typewriters I have for other reasons besides their use as a writer or as a machine for writing. So I think it's a little bit of a different perspective when it comes to keeping a typewriter, and that definitely influences what I would decide to keep as a collector. If you're going for more high value collectible items, I'm probably not that collector because I spend only $25 on each of my typewriters. And if you're going for super useful and works really well, I've kept some clunkers in my collection instead of keeping all the typewriters that work really well. If a machine writes really well, I tend to want to sell it. So those kind of parameters on my collecting are much more based on nostalgia, or just what I think is cool and interesting to feature on the YouTube channel. So I wanted to start by kind of going through Joe's model of how do we make decisions about which typewriters we keep, and one of the things he mentioned was having variety. Really usable machines, but also a variety of sizes and use cases. So he started by picking a desk standard, an ultra portable, an electric, and then a medium-sized portable. I don't have many electrics. In fact, I only have one electric in my collection right now, and that's for nostalgic purposes. So I don't really need an additional electric on top of that or a digital typewriter on top of that. So I decided to pick one desk standard, one ultra portable, 2 mid-size portables, and an electric typewriter. Starting with my desk standard machine. So if I was to pick overall across the entirety of my collection which desk standard I would pick or choose to keep, I would choose my Royal Victory model, or my Royal H. Now, this is from the 1940s, and the reason I would pick this machine is not because it works well. In fact, right now it's kind of inoperable. But I would pick to keep this machine overall across all of my desk standards because it belonged to my grandfather. So this is kind of one of the first bigger repairs I tackled as a collector. First time I resurfaced a platen, first time I took anything apart. This was kind of the beginning of the Just My Typewriter channel, and for me this project was a really important undertaking because it does belong to someone close to me. So I would choose to keep this machine. It does need some work, and in the hypothetical future that this is, I could work on that machine, but this would be the machine I choose to keep. There's cat hair in my lip gloss. I don't use desk standards very often. I find that it's difficult to find a good place for them to kind of be set up. I don't have a really sturdy or solid desk. That's something I'm waiting for a house to do. So right now, a lot of my desk standards are either in my office at work, because I have a really big bookshelf there. I have a Hermes Ambassador on the floor behind me, and then this Royal Victory model and my Royal 10 model are both on typing stands in my office here at home. So I find it really difficult to get to use my desk standards, and for me, I would be keeping this one more for sentimental reasons. reasons than for the use value of it, because I have other machines that I like to use better. On the opposite end of the spectrum from your desk standard machines, you have your ultra portables. They're lightweight portables, right? The smaller machines. These are the ones that come in cases. I have found over the years I don't really like ultra portables. They are not my style of machine. I much prefer the mid-size portable. So for me, these machines are not super useful. They're not super great to type on. So I went through kind of going through my collection, looking at the ones I do have, and I went for another nostalgia pick for this one as well. And I would decide to keep my Smith Corona Corsair Deluxe from the 1960s. Now, I have gone on record saying I hate this model, and that is true. I don't want to repair any more of these. They're a pain in the butt. I've done 3 of them, and they're just not for me. But my first ever typewriter was the Smith Corona Corsair Deluxe. And I got really lucky on my first typewriter. It was in really good condition and worked really well out of the gate. So I haven't had a lot of issues with this machine. And for me, having this machine is kind of representative of my collecting journey in general, because it's the first one I ever bought, and it's never going anywhere despite not using it very often. In fact, to film this video, this is the first time I think I've pulled it out of its case in about a year. Kind of keeping in theme with the nostalgia train, for my electric pick, I would keep my Electra 120. Number one reason being this is the only electric typewriter I have. But also this is the machine that my mom learned to type on, and both my grandparents did use this typewriter. So another really early one in my collection for me. It is a really nice mechanical electric typewriter, which means it still has some of the mechanical elements to it, but it is electric powered. You can still use a return lever on it, which is nice. There's no button for that. And for me, it's kind of a nice mesh of the portable typewriters and an electric typewriter all in one machine. It's in pretty good condition. It's obviously a little older. I don't buy electrics anymore because I have so much fear of selling them and them selling really well. Ironically, I've sold every electric typewriter I've ever had, but it's always a concern for me that they won't go really well, and I just don't use them. It's a whole extra step to take it out of the case and find an outlet to plug it into. And when it comes down to it, I really have to make this decision about what I keep in this overall pick in the mid-size portable collection. So I have mostly mid-size portable typewriters. These are the ones that I find most often in the wild. They're often the ones I can also get closest to that price range of $25. And there's just a lot of variety when it comes to mid-size portables. So I've had a really fun kind of time picking these up, learning how they work, and I also have had really good luck reselling these as well over any other model types I've had. So for me, the mid-size portable region, I've decided to pick 2 because I think this is a category where I'd get the most use out of the typewriter. And if I'm going to save 5 of them, I might as well have some that actually work. So I've decided to make 2 decisions here. The first is my Adler J3. I picked this typewriter up. Or no, I was gifted this typewriter for Christmas one year. I think it was around $16. It doesn't have a case, but it is by far one of my favorite typewriters to use. It's a really good size. It's a little bit smaller than some of the other typewriters in my collection, and it just operates incredibly smoothly. I really enjoy using this machine. It feels like a really effective process and just something I've really enjoyed using over the years. So if I'm keeping 5, I'm definitely keeping this one because it's the one I'll probably get the most use out of. And for my last mid-size portable choice, I have to keep a Smith Corona, and I'm going with my Smith Corona Clipper from the 1950s. Now this is a bare bones model. There is not much in here. In fact, it doesn't even have rabbit ears across the back, but this model for me is kind of the epitome of why I love 50s typewriters. They're well built, they have just enough on them to get the job done, but there's not so many bells and whistles that there's all these confusing levers and buttons that you don't know how they work. This machine is one that I picked up for $10 in Harrisburg. I have loved having this machine in my collection. I love the holiday case that it comes with, and for me, if I have to sit down and type something, this is usually my go-to machine. It is one that is just really powerful, really easy to clean and take apart and service, and one that I just have enjoyed so much having in my collection. So those are my top 5 picks for overall categories in those areas of desk standard, ultra portable, mid-size portable, and then also the electric typewriter. But there are some other ways that I could kind of break down this challenge, and one of those is based on use. Obviously, I have quite a few typewriters that are not in perfect condition, and I don't mind that, especially when it comes to machines that I'm saving for sentimental reasons, like the ones that have belonged to family members or who were gifted to me by important people. I'm saving those because they were gifted to me or they mean a lot to me, and I'd love to be able to pass them down. But when it comes to typewriters that work really well, I do have some other preferences. One of those being the best desk standard I think in my collection is probably my Royal HH. And if I had to pick based on ones to keep based on use, this is absolutely one that I would save. My Royal HH comes from the 1950s. I was gifted this pretty early on in my typewriter collecting journey. It was, I think, my first Christmas of typewriter collecting. It is such a beast of a machine. It works super well, really smooth imprints. It just works every single time and is in really good condition for how old it is. There's no rust anywhere on it. This machine is something that if I had to sit down and write my novel, this is the one that I would choose. So when it comes to saving machines based on use, this is absolutely one that I would keep. And I would keep other desk standard machines as well because I recently acquired a Hermes Ambassador, and for me this is just another fantastic machine for its use. Now, it does have a weak spring on the bottom, and as I was shooting the insert shots for this, I did have a little bit of trouble getting it to kind of operate. That's something I am working on fixing. I've replaced it a couple times, but it just takes a quick little flick of some metal parts down here at the bottom, and then it engages the typewriter again. For me, this is just such a solid typewriter. I love the way this is built. It's built so you can take off the entire carriage in one unit. You can take off all the casing. It's got such a heavy-duty frame, and I love the typeface on this machine as well. It is a Techno typeface typewriter, which is such an interesting little twist on a typical typeface, and this machine is just one of the greats in my collection. I really enjoy using this machine. I love the feel of the keys. If I had to keep 5 for use, this is absolutely one that I'd be saving. In addition to those two machines, 2 other ones I would save for use are obviously my Adler J3 and my 50s Clipper. Again, these are 2 of my favorite machines to actually write on, so it'd be important for me if I was using these typewriters for their use value to save those 2 as well. And I do want to add one more to the mix, and that would be my newest acquisition, a Royal Quiet Deluxe from the 1940s. So I have gone on record again saying how much I really dislike the 50s Royal Quiet Deluxes. There's a lot of reasons there. I don't like the way that they are built. I've never had one that consistently types really well. However, there are quite a few people recommended to me to try a QDL model from about 10 years before the ones I normally get. The 1940s QDLs came in a couple different styles, but the one I've always really loved the look of is the Dreyfus model. It's a little bit more square and angular. It's less rounded than the 50s variants, and I recently got one of these for $35 at a local thrift shop, so it was over my budget, but I figured it was $10 worth of a splurge here on this model because I've always wanted one, and I did want to try one out for the YouTube channel to kind of prove that I can conquer the Royal Quiet Deluxe, and this machine is just such a joy to use. The glass top keys on this machine are just really easy to kind of get the feel of. The imprint on the actual page is just so nice. It's just a solid and smooth typing experience. And obviously my cat also really likes this typewriter for some reason. But for me, this is just another machine that I would use the heck out of, and if I'm saving 5 typewriters for use, this has got to go on the page because I really have enjoyed the process of getting to know this typewriter. Now, I also make YouTube videos, so in addition to using typewriters for pen pal letters and crafts and using them for type tests here on the channel, I also have quite a few typewriters on display behind me, and over the years I've kind of saved some of the odder looking machines in my collection specifically for the act of displaying them. And despite all of the machines that I would use for their use value, I think this kind of deserves its own category. Not every typewriter collector is going to use every machine in their collection, and I think it's important to also acknowledge that sometimes we save typewriters that don't type super well, or maybe weren't designed the best, but we just love the aesthetics of them and we save them for those purposes. The first typewriter I would keep in this category of display is my Console 1511. This is my mystery machine. I don't really know much about the history of it. I picked it up in Maryland for, I want to say $15. It was a little bit of a rust bucket when I first bought it, but the color on this typewriter is just fantastic. It is this really light tealy blue. It's got gold lettering across the front that says Century, which is not Console's brand, but it is kind of the labeling associated with the machine. It types okay enough, it does work, and I have done quite a bit of rust removal on this machine, but as a display piece on the shelf, it is so eye-catching and something that I think is really interesting to have in the background of videos, and I just love the look of it. The rounded corners, they're a little bit higher than a Royal Quiet Deluxe from the 50s, so I just love the aesthetics of this machine, the color, and for me, this is a perfect display typewriter. Bonus, it does actually work as well. Kind of in that same vein, I also would keep my Underwood Star for display purposes. Again, just a gorgeous color on this machine. It is a much darker blue and it's a little bit more on the teal side. This is kind of the budget-friendly model from the Underwood Golden Touch line, so there's not a lot of bells and whistles on it, not a ton of functions, but the look of it is really kind of reminiscent of the 50s Underwood models. It's got this really interesting swoop design to the front. It doesn't have a push button front like some of the other Golden Touches I've had, but I just love the addition of the color on this model with that shape. It's just so interesting to look at. It does work, and it does have one of my favorite typefaces, which is that Continental typeface from Underwood. But for me, this machine as something on a shelf is just really interesting to look at and kind of reminiscent of what I like to have in my display typewriters. In those same lines, I have my Royal Safari from the 1960s. This was a trade machine for me. Now, this machine does type in script. It is the Royal Spencerian font or typeface on this machine. I, however, don't like using it. I think the typeface is really hard to read, and something about the side of the Royal Safari makes it really difficult for me to use the keyboard. However, I think this machine is such a fantastic display piece because of the color. So this is antique gold from the designer series of the Royal Safaris. It is such a difficult color to color match, and it really stands out and pops out in any background. I always see comments about what's that yellow typewriter on your shelves. That's what this model is, my Royal Safari. This is a machine that quite a few people have told me that they would like to have. And sometimes when somebody tells you they want your typewriter, it makes you want it more. Because this was a trade and it's my only script typewriter, this is one I will be saving for probably ever. But I do know that for me, it is something that I prefer to put on the shelves than use for actual use. I do use it every once in a while, especially when I want something with a little bit more of a classy font on it. But for me, this is a display item, and I really have enjoyed having it in videos. You can always see it in the background, and I think it's a really great visual model to look at. Maybe not my favorite to use. In those same lines, I have my Smith Corona Corsair Deluxe. Not my first typewriter, but my bedazzled typewriter, and this is actually in my office for display. I rescued this machine from Shop Goodwill. It was about $30 when all the shipping came into it as well. It was covered in jewels, and I removed them, I put it back together and made it work, and then I re-bedazzled it. Now for me, this is kind of a junk typewriter. I don't like using any of these Corsair models. It's not for me. It's missing the case topper, so it's already devalued a little bit, but I really liked how it turned out when I added those sparkles back onto it. I think it looks really different. In addition to it being my favorite color, I just think it stands out in an odd way in the background of things, and it's really cool to have in my office as well because students will be like, why is there a bedazzled typewriter in here? For me, this is kind of the epitome of how I do typewriter repair. I take something and I like to keep the odd factors to it, and for me that was a really interesting labor-intensive process, but I'm really happy with the result. So while I wouldn't use that typewriter to type, it does type. I would definitely use that more as a display item, and for me that is definitely representative of how I handle typewriter repair. And of course I can't talk about display typewriters without mentioning my Royal 10 Monster. So this was my year-long revamp project where I took a destroyed typewriter all the way down to the frame, repainted it, put it back together, and got it to somewhat work. This machine is still in definite need of some adjustments. It can type. It is possible. It's just it is such a process and almost annoying to use, but the visual aesthetics of this typewriter are something I really love. I love the little front on the Royal 10 models, that dip in the front. I've always loved the look of that. I have had the traditional black Royal 10, and I did gift that to another collector, but for me this is one that's never going anywhere, and I love to use it for display purposes as well because of the custom paint job, and specifically because of these custom stained glass panels that were made by Typewriter Chicago. Lucas in Chicago made these panels for me. I love the look of them. It really rises the aesthetic value of the machine, and it just gives this overall kind of cotton candy but classy appeal to this typewriter, and for me, this again is representative of my journey as a typewriter collector, and I just love the look of this. It's sitting in my office right now on a typing stand, and I love to look at it. I think as a display machine and not so much as a use machine, this for me is just really what it's all about in my collection. Taking something that was definitely ugly and making it something that maybe not a lot of collectors would love, but I love having in my collection. One thing I've also noticed about my collection is I save a lot of things for their sentimental value rather than their typical use or collectible value. And for me, this is kind of another category. So I've got like the overall picks, I have the use picks, the ones for display, but then there's this odd category for me that is kind of a mix of a lot of things. It's the one I'm saving because they were given to me by someone special, or I've had them so long it's difficult for me to get rid of them, or they're just so cool that I can't get rid of them or sell them. I have quite a lot of emotion tied up into some of these machines depending on the story behind them or where I got them. And for me, that's kind of a whole separate category. If you told me to save 5 typewriters for my collection based on my emotional connection to them, that might be this category of nostalgia or sentiment. So in this category, obviously I have my grandfather's machine, my Royal Victory model. Again, not a great typer yet, I'm working on it, but this is a machine that for me is a really important piece of my family's history and something that I would want to save. And I've got that sentiment attached to the machine itself. I think everybody's probably got a machine like that in their typewriter collection, something that was given to you by a family member or a friend, and you just want to save it because it's got that connection to somebody else. And I think those are important to acknowledge as well. Not every machine has to be the greatest typer, but you can save them for maybe more of their historical value or their personal historical value rather than their value as a collectible item. In that same category, I actually have my Smith Corona Classic 12. So this is one of my machines that I got earlier in my collection. I think it was my 12th typewriter ever. And this machine was given to me by my mentor at school. It was for my birthday one year, and he put it on my desk. And this is a machine that I just feel really attached to because that person is incredibly important to me. And to have something from them as I was going through grad school early on in my collection, I just think it's a really great sentimental piece and nostalgic piece. It also shows to me how far I've come in typewriter repair, going from my 12th typewriter all the way now to my probably 50 that I've had personally and have refurbished and sold. So that kind of journey as a collector is also an important thing that I like to have pieces from along the way. And for me, this is one of those models. It is a pretty solid typewriter. I don't use it very often because of the size of it. It's a little bit bigger than a traditional mid-size portable, but for me it's a solid machine. The typeface is a little smaller, and so I don't always gravitate toward it, but it's a really solid typer, and I really enjoy having something that connects me to that time in my life as well. Oh my goodness. Whose typewriter is this? Is this your typewriter?
That's my old one. We found it.
That's so awesome. I have 12 now. That's rough like this.
And it's actually called the Classic 12.
Is it? That's so cool. I think it would be impossible for me to talk about things that I save for nostalgic purposes without talking about my Royal Futura model. Now this is a model that I got kind of again early on in my collecting. I was obsessed with the look of the Royal Futura typewriters and their line along those same aesthetics from the 1950s and 60s. I've always loved the look of them with the really angular sides and kind of the bubbled top. The thing that I love most about the Royal Futura is the pop top. I think it's such a fun thing to add into a typewriter. And so when it comes to saving things for more of their sentimental value, this is definitely one of those models that I always want to have in my collection. Not because I use it very often. It has magic margins, which are not my favorite. And I will say the typing every once in a while, it feels a little like it's got too much slop in the basket, but for me this is a model that I just feel really attached to because I love the aesthetics of it. I wanted one for so long and finally was able to get one, and I just love having it in my collection and having it somewhere visible where I can enjoy it for more than just its uses as a typewriter. I would say in those same veins I have the Smith Corona Pacemaker. This is another one that I would say for more nostalgia purposes. It didn't belong to anyone that I knew. It wasn't a model that I was particularly fond of using, but there is is something about this machine that I just feel drawn to. Whether it's the sage green color or the cream keys or just the visual aesthetics of it, there's something about this machine that I just always gravitate toward using. Now this is in my office right now at work, so it doesn't get used as much, but it's one I'd have a really difficult time parting with, especially because I just think it's so different. I haven't seen a lot of pacemakers, and I haven't seen a lot of pacemakers like mine specifically. A lot of them have a little bit of a different aesthetic to the top of them. Sometimes they have some extra striping on them. I also really like the removable platen or the easy removable platen in this model. So for me, this is a model that maybe I don't use really often, but I got it so early in my collection that I kind of don't ever want to part with it just because I've had it for so long. And sometimes it can be really difficult to get rid of something you've had for 6 years. So for me, this is definitely a permanent in the collection. Despite not always using it and not always being able to articulate why, this is definitely one I feel really attached to. And of course, when it comes to nostalgia and sentiment, I have to pick a Barbie model in here as well. So I decided to go with one of my E17 models or E117 models. This Barbie typewriter journey for me has been such a whirlwind. It's probably the point of pride in my collection, all of my Barbie typewriters, because not a lot of people are collecting them. They're really hard to find. Sometimes they can be expensive. The other thing that is really cool about my Barbie collection is almost all of them were sent to me by subscribers like you guys. So people who I feel now I could call friends because they've been sending me these Barbie typewriters. This journey for me as a collector has been so reminiscent of what my content is on the YouTube channel, and for me, keeping one of the Barbie typewriters would be a really important part of my sentimental collection. It does not work well, and it's not great to work on. They're not built super well, but there's just something about them that I love having, and if I was keeping a collection based on sentiment, I absolutely would have to have one of these machines in there. It's just too important to me. Now there are models behind me that I didn't even put into any of these lists, and I think that's kind of the blessing and the curse of being a typewriter collector is you're going to run into all these models all the time, and you're going to have some in your collection that just don't hit any of those notes for you. And it's not because they're bad, it's because they work great, but they're not as great as other ones. And I do have quite a few typewriters in my collection that I just didn't even put into any of these lists, but I still have them. Models like my Remington 5, for example. This is one that I love the look of. It's from the 1940s. It aesthetically is beautiful. It actually works really well. I was able to replace the rubber, and that has made it work pretty well as a typewriter. But I just don't think it fit any of my personal categories. I also haven't had it very long, so I don't feel super close to it. I have found that the typewriters I have been selling are the ones that I've purchased over the last 2 or 3 years. They're not ones I've had the whole way through my collection. If I've had it for a really long time, I find it's more difficult to get rid of. So models like my Remington Deluxe, I probably will eventually part ways with, although I really like it. But Remington for me is just not a brand that I keep in my collection very often. So I didn't know where to place that one. Same with my Smith Corona Skywriter. Again, this is one I'm keeping because it was gifted to me by the guys at Typewriter or Austin Typewriter Inc. So I really love having this typewriter, but I just don't use it very often. If I had to travel, that's the model that I would take, but it didn't really fit any of my categories, especially when I'm thinking about ultra portables, and I've got more of a nostalgic tie to my Smith Corona Corsair Deluxe. Another model I didn't mention is my Adler J4. This is a recent purchase for me. I am still working on getting it to be perfect, but I think my Adler J3 is just a better model in general. It's smaller, it's two-toned as opposed to the one color, and it does everything I need. So for me, comparing those two models, I think I would go with the J3 every time over the J4. Despite it being a really good typewriter, I really do enjoy the Adler machines. I also didn't mention my Underwood 6 anywhere in there. Again, this is a typewriter I've had since probably the beginning of my collection. This is in my office at work, so it's not home where I would use it very often. It works, it's a really solid typewriter, but nothing that really feels like it fits into any of these specific you must save or they will go away categories. I've had it for forever. It was gifted to me alongside that Royal HH, so I will keep it forever, but not a machine that I feel fits any specific category. And then of course I have the Royal Scrittore, which I don't want and nobody else wants, so I don't think it belongs in any category. So those are kind of my thoughts on downsizing a collection. I think it's important to Think about how you collect things. My concept of collecting has changed over the last 6 years. It used to be that I bought everything in my price range anytime I saw it, and I very quickly amassed quite a few machines. I don't need all of these typewriters, but I do justify keeping quite a few of them to have some variety here on the YouTube channel. So I can do videos like this where I talk about all of my models, or I can do type tests where I show you the differences between a Royal and a Smith Corona and an Adler and a Remington. So having that variety for me as a content creator is great, but if I had to stop making content and downsize my collection to be a little bit more reasonable, those are some of the ways that I could foresee breaking down my collection and having 5 typewriters, maybe, to have and keep, and kind of keep the typewriter collecting in my household or in my home or in my life. Now, if you are a collector considering downsizing, I would recommend watching that Joe Van Cleave video, but I would also recommend, if you wanted to get rid of your machines, find a way to do it locally. Listing any of your typewriters on online sites becomes really difficult when you're considering and factoring in for shipping. So if you have a local typewriter store in your area or a local typewriter repair tech who needs models, that might be a really good way for you to offload those machines. I personally have had a lot of success using Facebook Marketplace. I will say that has changed in the last year. I haven't had as many sales of typewriters in the last year on Facebook Marketplace, but if you are looking to sell locally, that seems to be a really good way to do that. There's also other sites like Craigslist, and some places have Kijiji, so there are other ways to sell them more locally. You can avoid the shipping costs of sending a machine and the dangers of shipping a machine, and that seems to be a really good way to kind of get rid of machines that you might want to downsize in your collection. The other thing that I would recommend, and this is something I'm getting better at doing, is finding people in your life or around you who might also want to try a typewriter and being the person to give them that typewriter. So I have been able to give some typewriters to other collectors. I've been able to give typewriters to subscribers and friends who are looking for that first typewriter. For me, that's a really cool part of being a collector and knowing how to repair some of these models, is that I get to be the person who supplies somebody with their first machine. And that feeling is a really great part of being a collector. So if you are looking to downsize your collection, I would recommend seeing the people in your life and seeing if anybody around you wants a typewriter. I know that local schools, local libraries also have use for these machines, so you might find some more local ways to get rid of your machines in a more donate kind of way, but that's a great way to downsize your collection as well. If you're considering cleaning house and getting rid of some of your typewriters, there are some options out there as a collector that can just kind of help you figure out what you want to keep or what you have to keep and find new homes for the other machines in your collection that might be the right place for that machine. There's a lot that goes into thinking about what to sell and what to keep, and these are just some of the ways that I've been thinking about these more recently as a collector. If you're interested in more typewriter content, I do some other videos on this YouTube channel as well as on Instagram at just.my.typewriter. I'm also including the link to that Joe Van Cleave video down below, so make sure you go and check that out. I want to thank you all so much for watching and remind you, you're just my typewriter.